بسم الله الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله خاتم الأنبياء اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وأدبا وخلقا وحلما يا أكرم الأكرمين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم اهدنا واهد بنا واجعلنا سببا في نصر إخواننا في فلسطين وسائر بلاد المسلمين يا رب العالمين. Brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The topic assigned today, Palestine across the ages, is not one that can be crammed into an hour, nor an hour and a half, nor whatever time we have left until Salatul Isha. It's one that, with no exaggeration, can be made into a 200-part series, each and every single episode lasting an hour or an hour and a half. So the goal behind this lecture is not to focus on very specific historical details or accounts, but rather to point towards a particular idea, a salient point. And that salient point is that for those who assume that Palestine doesn't exist, I want to make it crystal clear, and we hope to understand and therefore make it crystal clear to ourselves and others that what an absurd position to have, to claim that Palestine does not exist. All I will do is I'll be a mouthpiece. A mouthpiece for what? A mouthpiece for irrefutable history. And we begin from the time of Nuh alayhi salam, wherein one of his sons, Lawith, became the father of the general land of Palestine. Of course, not too many details are mentioned concerning Lawith. However, we know that Al-Kan'aniyun, not necessarily the Canaanites, but Al-Kan'aniyun and the progeny of Lawith, who's the son of Nuh alayhi salam, eventually led to the differing tribes, the differing aqwam, the differing nations and peoples that constituted Palestine and the surrounding regions in the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam. For in the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam was Lut alayhi salam. And Lut alayhi salam gave da'wah to his people, and his people resided where? قرب البحر الميت, near, as historians or as المؤرخون والمفسرون, as the people of exegesis of the Quran and the historians say, والله أعلم, لكن Lut alayhi salam, Lot and his people were in this general region around the Dead Sea. And again, as I said, I don't want to recount the stories that we know per se. I want to point towards the same general idea, a lingering theme here. And so, the people of Lut, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed what He decreed for them, which is that He decreed to punish them for their sin in that general region. And once Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did that, the lands of Palestine at that time were more open, the lands of Palestine were more open to monotheism and tawheed and belief in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala after the da'wah of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Lut alayhi salam. Because Ibrahim alayhi salam used to travel to and fro from Jerusalem to Mecca, and from Mecca to Jerusalem. Tamam. We skip ahead to the time of Musa alayhi salam. To the time of Musa alayhi salam. طبعا, this is after the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. This is after the story of Yaqub and Yusuf alayhi salam. This is in the time of Musa alayhi salam. When Musa alayhi salam was finally able to move outside or allow for the, not exile, but the safe travel, passage and movement of Banu Israel, the people of Israel, from Egypt to Palestine. And when Musa alayhi salam told Banu Israel, after they had reached Jerusalem, يا قوم ادخلوا الأرض المقدسة التي كتب الله لكم ولا ترتدوا على أدباركم فتنقلبوا خاسرين. My people, enter the holy land which Allah has destined for you to enter, and do not turn back, or else you will become losers. Remember, Musa alayhi salam, just like سائر الرسل والأنبياء, Musa alayhi salam, just like all the other prophets and messengers, had the message of what? Tawheed, oneness in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And you'll find in the scriptures, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, many indications that Musa alayhi salam, of course, was a muwahhid, and his message was at-tawheed, belief in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, belief in the one true God. If we want to mention the account of the ijl, or the cow that, or the sculpture of a cow that As-Samiri constructed, this is recorded in the Old Testament as well. So that's something that is commonly accepted. So the da'wah of what Musa alayhi salam called to was the oneness in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a radiant theme, and we're going somewhere with this. And so his people responded, قالوا يا موسى إن فيها قوما جبارين وإنا لن ندخلها حتى يخرجوا منها فإن يخرجوا منها فإنا داخلون. They replied, O Moses, O Musa alayhi salam, there is an enormously powerful people there, so we will never, because we have to understand that Jerusalem at the time was not in the control of the people of Banu Israel, of course. Rather, they were in control of, or it was in control of the Babylonians at the time. Or rather, the Babylonians, and in this period of time, there was a constant back and forth between the Babylonians and other general peoples of that area. However, the people at the time were the Babylonians. And so they said, O Moses, there is an enormously powerful people there, so we will never be able to enter it until they leave. And if they do, then we will enter. Very interesting. So Musa alayhi salam, after the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, told these people, told Banu Israel, that Jerusalem and Al-Quds, and by extension Palestine, is promised for you. Musa being what? A muwahhid, believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, believing in all of the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, believing in the omnipotence and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, قال رجلان من الذين يخافون أنعم الله عليهما ادخلوا عليهم الباب فإذا دخلتموه فإنكم غالبون وعلى الله فتوكلوا إن كنتم مؤمنين. Two God-fearing men who had been blessed by Allah said, surprise them through the gate. If you do, you will certainly prevail. Put your trust in Allah if you are truly believers. So as we said, Jerusalem and Al-Quds was promised for Musa alayhi salam, and promised for Al-Muwahhidun, promised for the ones who believed in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wahdah, alone, and believed in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the Mufassirin, the people of tafsir, generally differ on who these two people were. Some say that it was Musa, one of the men was Musa alayhi salam, and that the other man was the Nabi of Allah, Yusha' bin Nun. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. The point is though, notice that the premise is not, or al-ibratu laysat bil-kathrah. It's not about how many people. It's about that, well, if the land has been promised, if the land has been promised for the righteous, then it needn't matter how many people enter the door. قالوا يا موسى إنا لن ندخلها أبدا ما داموا فيها فاذهب أنت وربك فقاتلا إنا هاهنا قاعدون. Yet they said, O Moses, Still, we will never enter as long as they remain there. So go, both you and your Lord. Ajib. Don't they view Musa alayhi salam as the prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as the messenger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Both you and your Lord, and fight. We are staying right here. After it was promised to them, Musa alayhi salam said, قال رب إني لا أملك إلا نفسي وأخي فافرق بيننا وبين القوم الفاسقين. Musa alayhi salam pleaded, O Lord, my Lord, I have no control over anyone except myself and my brother, so set us apart from the rebellious people. قال فإنها محرمة عليهم 40 سنة يتيهون في الأرض فلا تأس على القوم الفاسقين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala replied, then this land is forbidden to them for 40 years, during which they will wander through the land. So do not grieve for the rebellious people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promised this land for al-muwahhidin, for the ones who believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for the ones that follow Musa alayhi salam and his way, and the way of righteousness and the way of tawheed and belief in the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Yet as punishment, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, let them be forbidden from entering this land and allow them to travel like Bedouins. Fittih. Attih is like the open expanses of the desert surrounding Palestine and Egypt. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, however, gave them food and gave them drink, al-man wa salwa. However, the salient point here is that even though it was promised to them, they denied. I'm working towards a theme here. I want us to fast forward now. I want us to fast forward to before the liberation of Palestine at the hands of Umar radiallahu anhu, wherein Jerusalem, since as far back as we can trace, has always been a point of niza', a point of dispute, wherein empires, kingdoms, and peoples would fight over. For what? For its riches, for its crops, for its views, for religious authority. Yes, it was a strategic position, but for religious authority. And so, the Sassanids and the Byzantine Empire were at war in this period of time. Before Umar radiallahu anhu, before the battle of Al-Qadisiyah, before the battle of Tabuk, before these battles, this land was a land of great strife and war and battle between the Sassanids and between the Byzantines. And so the Jews residing therein, we have to understand that from the moment Isa alayhi salam was sent, there was a great animosity that developed between the Jews and the Christians. Because what did they differ over? They differed over the nubuwwah of Isa alayhi salam. They differed over the prophethood of Jesus, Isa alayhi salam. Whether we want to talk about the battle of, or rather the incident of the trench in Yemen, wherein the Jews massacred the Christians, or whether we want to talk about when the Christians grew in power and they became, or I don't want to say infiltrated, but the Romans accepted the belief of Christianity and accepted it as a doctrine, and they grew in power, and Heraclius was in power, and this became a matter of back and forth between the Jews and the Christians. And so the Jews, so as to protect themselves, took the side of the Zoroastrians, of the Sassanids. And so as this back and forth was going on, and as things developed, and as the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sent as the final messenger, thereafter, after the death of the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and after the Khilafah of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, after the Caliphate of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, thereafter came the Khilafah of Umar radiallahu anhu. And it came to the moment wherein Umar bin al-Khattab, he liberated Jerusalem, not anwatan, but sulhan. Umar bin al-Khattab did not come to Jerusalem as an invading force, but he came to Jerusalem with a message of peace and with a matter that has already been declared. And we all know the story of Umar bin al-Khattab coming forth to the gates of Jerusalem in ragged clothing, not even on horseback, not on camelback, and not even on the back of his donkey, but rather holding his donkey and walking to the door of Jerusalem, wherein the Christians and the Jews that met him therein recognized that this was the very man that was prophesied in their scriptures. And so Umar ibn al-Khattab, at that moment in time, became the natural leader of Palestine and the surrounding regions. So it was a peaceful acquisition of Jerusalem. And there was a firm emphasis placed by Umar ibn al-Khattab radiyallahu anh, as per the Sharia, as per the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for allowance of the Jews and the Christians to maintain their religious beliefs and places of worship. And the Muslims continued to follow the principles of the covenant of Umar radiyallahu anh with non-Muslims in Jerusalem for centuries. Which is what? All that is asked of the dhimmi, ahlul dhimma. First off, before I continue, what is the dhimmi? What is meant by the term ahlul dhimma? Ahlul dhimma refers to the Christians and the Jews that live under Islamic rule. Ahlul dhimma can be translated as the people who are to be protected. The people who are to be protected. By who? By the Muslimin. So Umar ibn al-Khattab declared that the Jews and the Christians have their own places of worship, their own synagogues, their own monasteries, their own methods of finance concerning themselves, their own laws concerning themselves, their own areas, their own suburbs, their own towns. And so the Muslimin upheld this for centuries, because this isn't just a matter of politics, this isn't a political outlook, but this is the deen. We consider them ahlul dhimma whenever they are under Islamic rule. The Christians and the Jews are to be protected. And all we ask of them is the jizya. All we ask of them whenever the Christians and the Jews are under Islamic rule, and Islamic rule is a whole other discussion, and behind it are many conditions. However, whenever Christians and Jews were under Islamic rule, all that was asked of them is al-jizya. And al-jizya is a very simple fee or tax that is subject to change. And it's not that the Muslims weren't taxed, because the Muslims had to pay what? Zakat. And the point of al-jizya, which was the tax or the fee that the Christians and the Jews had to pay under Islamic rule, the point of it was to have or generate enough income to be used as primarily what? As protection for the Christians and the Jews. So that which they paid was for their own protection. Was for their own protection. Was to defend their towns, to defend their ird, to defend their women, the children and the elderly, to defend their establishments. When are we talking? We are talking the 6th century, Common Era. We're talking the 1st century, Hijri. We're talking 1,400 years ago. The Palestine of 1,400 years ago. And so the Jews lived alongside Muslims and Christians in Jerusalem without oppression, security for their lives, properties and places of worship. Without getting into too many of the details, but some 3 centuries later, 3 to 4 centuries later, when Palestine had been under numerous empires and many things had transpired, at this point in time, the Seljuks, a Muslim empire, had some level of rule over Jerusalem. But this was the time of the Crusaders. This period of time, wherein the first crusade, the second crusade, and the third crusade took place, and the crusades thereafter. This was a time wherein Europe was in a level of shambles, politically and religiously. It was a time of great turbulence. And sometimes, in times of great turbulence and great change, the one thing that can solve that or address that is a unified benefit. And the unified benefit for many of the Christians residing in Europe was a crusade, was a claim to Jerusalem. Because, again, we have to understand that their motive in this point in time, so as to reclaim their position as the Christians and so as to reclaim their position as the religious authority, their claim was that the Jews killed Jesus. Of course, us as Muslimin, we believe what? وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ وَمَا صَلَبُوهُ وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ. They did not kill him, they did not crucify him. Rather, it was made to appear so. However, that animosity between the Jews and the Christians had certainly existed. And by extension, these groups of Christians, mainly coming from Europe, from Germany, from Italy, from France, and from England at the time, and many other countries, or nations, or kingdoms, by extension, they had a level of animosity towards the Muslimin. So, we have to understand that this did not comprise of all of the Christians, but it comprised of some of these great empires and kingdoms. And so what did they do? What did they do so as to claim religious authority? Pay attention to this pattern. They allowed, first off, they had to create a narrative. They had to say that this land is ours because of religious authority and because of ethnic authority, because of Roman presence at the time, or previously, Roman presence that had been in the lands of Palestine, as the Romans deemed it, about 1,000 years prior. So, they wanted to make an argument for religious authority and ownership and claimants of Jerusalem and ethnic authority and claimants over Jerusalem. So what did they do? One of the accounts of the historian, of one of the historians, when the Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem, they did not leave a single Jew alive in the holy city, gathering them in their synagogue and setting it on fire with them inside. Massacres upon massacres upon massacres of the Jews and the Muslims along the way to Jerusalem. So before they even got into Jerusalem, anyone who supported them, they did not kill. Anyone who they felt did not support them, including Christians, they would massacre them. They would kill them. Pay attention to certain themes, to certain patterns, and think to yourself whether they are relevant in the modern day or not. And so it was narrated that after the Crusaders burned their synagogues, they captured the remaining Jews and sold them in slave markets at the lowest prices, selling 30 Jews for just 1 golden dinar, justifying their actions as revenge for the killing of Jesus Christ, alayhi salam. Harsh treatment of the inhabitants of Palestine by the Crusaders, selling of surviving Jews in slave markets at low prices. And so in this fateful year, in these 10 days of 1099 Common Era, this mass genocide that historians estimate comprised of a minimum of 70,000, consisting of majority Muslim and the rest Jews and Christians, to a maximum of 100,000 or above, were massacred. Reports from all sources indicated that the streets of Jerusalem were several centimeters deep in blood in a mere 10 days. The grounds of Al-Aqsa were rendered stables for horses, with some sections reserved for a pigsty. Ajallukumullah. Corpses were burnt, fingers were severed, stomachs were cut and opened in search for gold, jewelry, and valuables. I'd like to stop here for a moment to point towards a certain idea. Realize how any idea, any doctrine, any belief, and any religion can be weaponized given the circumstance. Yani if the situation suits it, and if there's an opportunity, the wicked will take it. What we see today in Gaza is nothing new. I just relayed to you what people are capable and were capable of doing on horseback and with arrows and with basic versions of arson and fire, were capable of doing in the year 1099 in Common Era, in 10 days. 70,000 to 100,000 people massacred. This is not an old issue. This is not an old conflict. This is not an old dispute. And this is not an old country, or rather, this is not a new belief. Forgive me. This is not a new belief. This is not a new dispute. This is not a new this is not a new war. It's the same general principles. It's the same general conditions, but allotted and orchestrated in different ways given the circumstance. This is nothing new. It's the same general concept iterated in a different way concerning a land that is not new as opposed to another. And then came Salahuddin, rahimahullah, lifting the ban of Jewish residents in Jerusalem. And there was positive treatment and re-establishment of Jewish communities and synagogues. And we all know how Salahuddin treated the Christians and his conversations and discussions with Richard the Lionheart, or so was mentioned, or so was claimed. One of the accounts of the historians, when Sultan Salahuddin al-Ayyubi recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, notice, 88 years later, he lifted the ban on Jewish residents in the city and throughout Palestine. Jews came from France, Morocco, Germany, and southern England, with many settling in the Holy Land. What does this tell you? This tells you that the Jews resided in places where they were being oppressed. And where did they move to find peace and solace? They moved to Muslim rule. They moved to Palestine to seek refuge. Who was it? Who was it that wanted peace and claimed peace? Who was it that accepted the Christians and Jews with open arms? Thereafter was freedom of movement and economic activities for Jews, Jewish involvement in trade, textiles, jewelry, and medicine, integration into the social fabric of Jerusalem, and likewise for the Christians under Muslim rule. Thereafter came the Mamluk era, and the Mamluks followed the Ayyubids' examples in treating Jews well and Christians well, allowing them to reside and establish their synagogues and prayers. Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, when the Mongols had cast their scourge and had invaded the lands and came far from the east and ravaged and ransacked all the lands in between Mongolia all the way up until Iraq. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah told them, "We will not be satisfied until all the captives from among the Jews and Christians are freed, for they are under our protection." The Muslims took pride. They took pride in what? Not in killing Jews, not in killing Christians, but in protecting them. In protecting them. Because this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed for the Muslimin, to protect them We will not leave a single captive from the people of the covenant or the people of the faith. And yet, how is the favor returned to the Muslimin? How are they treated? What propaganda is cast against the Muslimin? Let history speak. Thereafter came the Ottoman Empire, wherein the Ottomans created a multiple step system known as the millet system, coming from the word millah, which means doctrine, wherein they had separate municipalities for Jews and Christians, with their own laws, with their own policies, with their own miniature economies, and their own way of running their own towns. And Jews were allowed to move freely within the country, engaging in all financial activities such as buying, selling, and manufacturing. And they, as we mentioned, took over important industries like textiles. And in Ottoman Jerusalem, there were several Jewish sects, such as the Ashkenazim and Sephardim and Karaites, each with their own representative, their own mayors or their own ministers. Look at the level of freedom that they had under Muslim rule. It wasn't just, you may reside here, but rather they were given an opportunity to flourish amongst themselves. A system that lasted for centuries. And when the conquistadors of Spain ousted the Muslims, the Christians that were subservient to the Muslims at the time in Islamic Golden Age Spain, when they were driven out and massacred by the Spanish conquistadors, where did the Jews go? To Palestine. Under whose rule? Under Muslim rule. In the year 1622, Common Era, in the year 1622, the judge of Jerusalem and the deputy governor of the Jerusalem district supervised the renovation of the Ashkenazi synagogue according to the conditions they committed to. And this renovation was a constant process that was repeated up until the early 18th century. What does this show us? Not only were they allowed to reside, but they were given funding for renovation. This is an issue of fiqh. This is an issue of Islamic jurisprudence. Can a general Islamic governance provide financially so that Ahlul Kitab, so that Christians and Jews may renovate or may fix up any loose ends in their places of worship? That's a different discussion. But I want you to focus on the general premise that Muslims not only allowed them to reside, but they facilitated for them. Karen Armstrong, a renowned historian, made a number of observations concerning Jewish presence and residence in Muslim lands, and particularly in Jerusalem. He remarked, "We are not in exile here as we are in our country. The customs and tax officials here are Jews, and there is no special tax imposed on Jews." So it's not beyond the jizya and beyond the tax that had been existing for centuries that Christians and Jews had to pay for their own protection. There were no specific sanctions, there were no specific taxes that were imposed on them. Armstrong also asserts that the Ottomans did not strictly apply Sharia law regarding financial arrangements for Jews. Not all Jews had to pay the jizya, and those who did pay, paid the minimum amount. The courts protected Jews and accepted their testimony, and the independence of the Jewish community was encouraged and protected by Ottoman officials. Who else established justice for centuries on end, for over a millennia and close to a millennia and a half, like the Muslims? Who else? Which is why it's incredibly mind-blowing that a statement of propaganda can even be made against the Muslims concerning this matter. And it's even more astonishing to claim that Palestine didn't exist and never existed. The Balfour Declaration of 1918. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Britain supported and advocated for the Balfour Declaration, which I don't want to get too much into it, but paved the way. This declaration paved the way for Jewish and particularly Zionist settlement in Palestine. What is Zionism? I don't need to explain what Zionism is. However, it denotes that the lands of Palestine belong completely and entirely to and for the Jews, right? And that they have complete claimants and complete ownership of that land. And so when this happened in 1918, the Muslims by and large still not only lived in those lands, but ran matters or administered the affairs of Palestine at the time and of that region. Did they put up a fight and say to specifically the Jews that wanted to take over Palestine at the time, did they put up a fight and say, no, you're not allowed to enter? Or did they open their hands and welcome them with open arms, saying, you may enter and you may live next to us as neighbors? What happened 30 years later? The ultimate backstab and Nakba, wherein Palestinians were ousted, exiled and massacred in the West Bank and driven out from the West Bank. Many of them going to where? Going to Gaza. And 70 years later, 76 years later, it persists. 76 years later, now they're being driven out of Gaza. And they're being butchered. And they're being killed en masse. Under what premise? That Palestine never existed. That we are to those who claim from amongst the Jews, a sizable amount of them, we are the original owners of this land, as per our rights of when? Not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, not 50 years ago, not 100 years ago, not 200, not 500, 2,000 and over 2,000 years ago, since the time of David or Dawood alayhi salam. Ajib. Imagine if we were to apply that concept. Imagine if we were to say that ethnically speaking, because the claim is of two parts, that there's ethnic claim and that there is religious authority and claim over Palestine. Let's address the ethnic argument. If they are going to make the claim that they are the rightful ethnic rulers of that land, then what do we say about the indigenous peoples of every single other part of planet Earth? You can't apply a principle here and discard everything else. You can't discard all the other countries wherein people were ousted from their land. So that argument is not going to fly. And it's a fallacy and it's a complexity. Then there's the religious discussion. And that one has more bearing. And it's one that is worth discussing, because the other one is mardud. It's completely rejected. And even if they do have ethnic claim to the land, does that mean that it is okay to butcher and to massacre? Butcher and massacre the people that lived alongside them, that cared for them, that dealt with them only with peace and only with open arms. So from a religious point of view, that's a different discussion. And we say we're ready to have that discussion. And I'm not going to get into details, but all I will say is let history be the example. Let the statistics speak. Who propagated peace from day one? Who allowed for everyone to live with each other in harmony across the ages? and who didn't? And that's a question worth asking. And so this is the salient point, that Palestine not only has always existed, but beyond that, it has existed and it has been administered in a fashion that comprised of justice and comprised of harmony, peace and unity and coexistence for hundreds of years. To rewrite the status quo is not going to work. Whenever you feel a level of doubt, don't look to propaganda, look to history. Look to history. History is the best example. Will you find certain moments wherein Muslims themselves had a level of, or cast a level of injustice upon others? Absolutely. Because the propagator of a doctrine is not like the doctrine itself. Yani, we have to differentiate between a belief and the ones who claim to believe in a belief. But the long and short of it is, refer to history. Read your history. Read Jewish and Christian accounts of how the Muslims coexisted and facilitated for the Christians and the Jews. Read your history. Read the seerah of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Read how Umar bin Khattab radiyallahu an, after peaceful liberation of Al-Quds and Jerusalem, approached these matters. Observe. And finally, we say that bloodshed will never last forever. And if someone has to resort to bloodshed and the killing of mostly women and children, then understand that they are trying to fill in an ideological void and a discrepancy, and that their argument and their narrative does not hold up, and so therefore, so as to get their way, they are going to have to take the most extreme measures possible. So much so that even when I asked Google, and I asked the AI of Google what was the Balfour Declaration, just to see whether it was going to be biased or open-minded or open-ended, so on and so forth, Google, not me, Google, Gemini, the AI, said what? It referred to the Balfour Declaration as being the declaration that paved the way for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Not me. It's come to a point where not just the ICC, not just the ICJ, not just many countries of Europe, not just South Africa, not just essentially majority of the population of planet Earth are against the narrative or the propaganda that is being forced down people's throats, but even artificial intelligence, which relies on the pools of information online that is heavily smeared with propaganda. Even artificial intelligence can recognize right from wrong here. And with this we say, Palestine has existed for the ages and will continue to exist for the ages. And history stands as a testament to the people of the present and the people of the future. And we say, do not worry, for yes, there is blood being shed. But number one, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not ghafil amma kanu ya'malun. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is aware and notices and sees what the oppressors do, and that the oppressors have a maw'id, have a meeting on the Day of Judgment. And as well, notice that people can recognize the discrepancies and the oppression in our modern day. So imagine those who will open the history books or who will look back in history some 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years from now. And they'll be able to recognize right from wrong. If we can do it now, can you imagine how bad this is going to look? Subhanallah. With this I say سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. اللهم اجعلنا سببا في نصر إخواننا في فلسطين وغزة والسودان وسائر بلاد المسلمين يا رب العالمين.